Outnumbered and outgunned, but not ready to give up the fight. The enormous 18-inch shells from the Japanese battleship Yamato screamed overhead like locomotives, throwing towering plumes of seawater onto our destroyer's deck. I held the USS Johnston's steel rail as another salvo bracketed us. The blast nearly sent me stumbling. 23 Japanese warships were bearing down on our small escort carrier group off Samar's coast. Their combined firepower could have leveled a town. Facing them were 7 American destroyers and destroyer escorts. Together, we barely equaled the punch of a single enemy battleship. The arithmetic was simple, savage, and terrifying. Yet when I saw Captain Ernest Evans order full speed directly into the enemy's line, something clicked inside me that morning and never left. Sometimes the impossible becomes unavoidable when ordinary men choose to do extraordinary things. My name is Robert Hogan, and I was a 22-year-old gunner's mate aboard the USS Johnston on the morning of October 25, 1944. We were part of Taffy 3, a group of 6 escort carriers and 7 screening vessels assigned to support the American invasion of the Philippines. These were not the headline-grabbing fleet carriers or the propaganda-dominating battleships. We were the workhorses, the overlooked ships that kept supplies moving and provided close air cover to Marines ashore. The sun had barely cleared the horizon when our radar operator's voice cut through the ship's chatter like a blade. Multiple surface contacts bearing north-northwest ranged 25,000 yards and closing fast. Captain Evans was on the bridge within seconds, his weathered face hard as he studied the scope. What he saw changed everything. The largest Japanese surface force in 2 years was steaming toward us at over 20 knots. 4 battleships led the line, including the massive Yamato and Nagato, each mounting guns far larger than anything in our task group. 6 heavy cruisers followed with their 8-inch batteries trained forward like predators' eyes. 11 destroyers flanked the formation, each individually more powerful than our little Johnston. Admiral Kurita's center force had achieved total tactical surprise. They slipped through the Philippine Islands under cover of darkness, evaded our submarines, and now threatened to wipe out the only naval barrier between them and thousands of American troops ashore. If they broke through our thin screen, the invasion itself would be at risk. General quarters, all hands, man your battle stations. The alarm's klaxon screamed as hundreds of sailors raced to their posts. I ran to my station at the number 2 5-inch mount, my heart pounding. My gun crew moved with drilled precision, loading shells and locking firing solutions as the enemy grew larger on the horizon. Captain Evans's voice rang out over the ship's speakers, steady despite the odds. Men, this is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to come along had better get off right now. Not one man headed for the life rafts. The escort carriers behind us were already launching every plane they could, their short decks a frenzy as torpedo bombers and fighters clawed for altitude. Still, we all knew the numbers. Taffy 3's 6 carriers carried fewer than 180 aircraft between them, and most were armed with bombs for supporting ground troops, not the armor-piercing ordnance needed to cripple heavily armored warships. At 06:58, the Japanese opened fire. The sound was unlike anything I'd heard before, a rolling thunder that seemed to shake the ocean itself. Shells the size of small cars arced across the sky, their splashes marked by colored dyes streaking through the morning, red, green, yellow, blue, each ship using different colors to spot their fall, turning the looming slaughter into a grotesque fireworks show. The first salvos fell short, spraying massive waterspouts half a mile ahead of our formation. But with every minute the enemy gunners closed the range. Shells began landing nearer, their impacts sending shocks through the sea that we felt in our bones. Captain Evans made the call that would shape his legacy and the battle that followed. Rather than turn away from the overwhelming force, rather than order a retreat that might have saved his ship and crew, he chose to strike. All ahead flank speed, he ordered. Right full rudder. We're going to engage the enemy. The Johnston surged forward like a racehorse freed, her 4 boilers working to squeeze every ounce of power into the props. Black smoke belched from our funnels as we poured on speed, pushing past 35 knots and racing straight at a Japanese heavy cruiser that outweighed us roughly 3-1. Behind us, the destroyer Hole and the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts mirrored our move. their commanders making the same impossible decision to charge toward certain death rather than abandon the carriers they were sworn to shield. Range 8,000 yards and closing. I called for the fire control officer. Target bearing 045, heavy cruiser Kamado class. Commence firing, Evans ordered. Our 5-inch batteries answered with a steady, rolling thunder, hurling armor-piercing rounds downrange at nearly 3,000 feet per second. The Japanese returned fire at once, their 8-inch guns flaring orange in the early light. The disparity in ammunition was brutal. Our 5-inch shells weighed about 54 pounds each, while their 8-inch rounds tipped the scales at well over 250 pounds. Still, we had benefits they lacked. A smaller silhouette that was harder to hit, and superior radar-directed fire that sharpened our aim. Within minutes, we found our mark on the Kamado, rounds punching into her superstructure and igniting fires along her forward deck. The fight was on, and there was no turning back. In the next 20 minutes, the calm sea off Samar turned into a tableau of naval carnage. The Johnston tore through the enemy line like a terrier among wolves, her guns never ceasing as we traded shot for shot. We fired so fast that the paint blistered from the barrels and spent brass carpeted the deck, rattling with every tack and turn. Through the gun shield, I watched our rounds slam home against the heavy cruiser Kimono, orange flashes, choking black smoke pouring from her forward works. She lurched under the punishment. Her rate of fire fell as damage crippled her fire control gear. The Japanese were not finished. A salvo from the cruiser Chakama straddled us, throwing mountains of seawater onto the deck. The concussion knocked several of my gun crew flat and near misses peppered our hull like hail on a tin roof. "Torpedo attack! Torpedo attack!" came the shout. "Stand by for launch." Our torpedo officer, Lieutenant Commander Robert Hogan, no relation to me despite the name, ran his tubes onto the kimono. At under 10,000 yards, a target that size was hard to miss, but closing in meant holding a steady course for precious seconds while shells fell around us like deadly rain. Fire 1. Fire 2. 10 Mark 15. Torpedoes slid from their tubes in sequence, their wakes forging parallel white trails toward the enemy. Each warhead carried over 600 pounds of explosive, enough to break a heavy cruiser's back if it struck true. We didn't wait to see every result. Evans jammed the helm hard left, and the Johnston listed so far over seawater swept across the main deck. Columns of smoke and flame bloomed astern where at least 2 torpedoes had struck. The heavy cruiser Kimono slowed drastically, her bow riding low as flooding swamped forward compartments. But our attack exacted a terrible price. A salvo from the battleship Congo struck us amidships, 3 14-inch shells in rapid succession. The first destroyed the gyro compass and severed steering control from the bridge. The second tore into the engine room, killing a dozen men outright and dropping our speed to barely 15 knots. The third proved a dud, punching clean through the hull without detonating but leaving a jagged breach above the waterline. Evans was hit by shrapnel from the first burst, his face laced with blood from many cuts, yet he refused treatment. "I can see and I can fight," he snarled at the corpsman who reached for him. "That's all that matters now," he said. With primary steering lost, we were forced to control the ship from the emergency helm deep in the stern. Communication with the engine room was severed, so orders had to be ferried by messengers running through smoke-filled passageways while enemy shells continued to fall. Our forward gun mount was knocked out entirely, leaving only 3 5-inch guns to carry the fight. Still, the Johnston was not done. As we limped through the haze and chaos, Evans spotted a squadron of Japanese destroyers closing on our carriers and ordered an immediate attack, driving us straight into a point-blank duel with 5 enemy destroyers. The range shrank to under 6,000 yards, practically knife-fighting distance at sea. Our remaining batteries hammered the lead destroyer while she poured everything she had back at us. Shell splashes laddered along both hulls as the two sides beat each other mercilessly. At that distance, our radar-directed fire control proved decisive. While the Japanese crews fumbled to track us in the smoke and spray, our guns found their mark again and again. Within 10 minutes, the enemy destroyer was afire from stem to stern, and her crew abandoned ship as flames raced toward her magazines. The price of victory was staggering. The Johnston had absorbed more than 40 direct hits from enemy shells ranging from 5-inch to 14-inch. Our hull was raked with holes, the superstructure twisted into a ruin, and casualties climbed by the minute. Of the original 327 souls aboard, well over 100 were dead or wounded. Yet against all odds, we kept fighting. While the Johnston clawed for survival, the other destroyers and escorts in our task group were writing their own desperate chapters in what would come to be known as the Battle of Samar. The destroyer, Hole, under Commander Leon Hole, drove straight at the Japanese battleships in an assault so daring it bordered on madness. I caught flashes of the Hole through the choking smoke as she charged the massive Yamato, her guns spitting defiance at a vessel whose firepower could match whole fleets. The sight was as stirring as it was tragic. The little destroyer, barely 350 feet long and under 2,500 tons, was taking on a battleship that displaced more than 70,000 tons and carried 9 18-inch guns. Commander Hull knew the odds. His ship had no real chance of surviving that clash, but he also knew every minute he kept the enemy busy gave the escort carriers a better shot at escape. So he pressed home the attack with near-suicidal courage, closing to point-blank range and firing a torpedo at the giant enemy ship. The Yamato was forced to turn away to dodge the torpedo run, putting her massive batteries out of the fight for precious minutes as she maneuvered to avoid the lethal fish speeding toward her hull. The price for that small victory was terrible. Japanese cruisers and destroyers focused on the Hole, hammering her from every side. I watched in horror as a barrage of 16-inch shells from the battleship Congo slammed into her midships, and the destroyer vanished in a towering plume of smoke and flame. The blow shattered her back. When the smoke cleared, she listed badly to port, her hull ripped open like a can, yet her remaining guns still barked at the enemy. Commander Hull kept the Hole fighting for another hour, despite damage that should have sent her down immediately. With power gone, steering destroyed, and water pouring through dozens of shell holes, the crew manhandled the guns, training and firing them by hand at any Japanese ship within range. Their raw grit and determination impressed even the enemy. Eventually, the Hole was overwhelmed by flooding and rolled over, taking 253 of her 327 men with her. But those precious minutes she bought allowed 2 escort carriers to slip away and saved the thousands of sailors and airmen aboard them. Equally astonishing was the story of the destroyer escort. Samuel B. Roberts, Sammy B. to her crew, under Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland. Classified as a destroyer escort rather than a full destroyer, she nonetheless rushed into battle against Japanese heavy cruisers with a ferocity that defied belief. At only about 350 tons and armed with just 2 5-inch guns, the Samuel B. Roberts was the smallest ship in our task force and by any sane measure had no business tangling with cruisers that outweighed her 10-1. But logic had no place off Samar that morning. Copeland drove his ship to within 4,000 yards of the heavy cruiser Chuma before opening fire. At that distance, nearly every round hit, and the escort's rapid 5-inch fire walked a steady stream of shells along the length of the enemy cruiser. The Japanese ship, clearly not expecting such aggression from so small an opponent, was slow to respond effectively. Samuel B. Roberts also carried 3 torpedo tubes, and Copeland pressed in until the range was right, then loosed all 3. At least one torpedo struck home, ripping a massive hole in Chuma's hull and leaving her badly down by the bow. But the Samuel B. Roberts could not absorb such punishment forever. Japanese cruisers and destroyers zeroed in and pummeled her from multiple directions. A 14-inch shell from the battleship Congo broke her keel, and she began settling by the stern. Even as the ship sank, Copeland kept fighting. The forward 5-inch mount fired until seawater lapped the breach, and sailors hand-passed shells to the aft gun until the list made it impossible. When Sammy B. finally rolled and sank, she had been in continuous action for more than 2 hours. Of her crew of 224, 89 were killed, and the survivors were taken aboard other ships in the task group. The sacrifices of the Hole, the Samuel B. Roberts, and the Johnston were not in vain. Their desperate resistance, combined with relentless airstrikes from the escort carriers, began to exact a heavy toll on the Japanese fleet and completely disrupted Admiral Kurita's plan. He had expected to punch through our thin screen and then finish off the escort carriers at leisure. Instead, his powerful force was scattered across miles. Individual ships forced into evasive maneuvers to avoid torpedoes, and his formation's cohesion was shattered. The heavy cruiser Suzuya was left burning and forced to withdraw. The kimono was badly crippled by torpedoes and barely steerable. 2 Japanese destroyers were sunk outright, and several more were damaged and lagging behind, and concentrated attacks from our small ships had knocked out fire control systems on several capital ships. The battleship Haruna was left temporarily blind when a 5-inch round from the Johnston smashed into her main fire control radar. The heavy cruiser Tone suffered similar damage, forcing her to slow her rate of fire while crews scrambled to make repairs. Perhaps even more consequential was the psychological effect of our reckless charge. Admiral Kurita, watching the fierce resistance from ships he had expected to rout, began to suspect he was up against a far larger American force than his intelligence had indicated, and the possibility that he might be blundering into a trap weighed on his decisions. Meanwhile, the escort carriers of Taffy 3 fought desperately to survive while their planes joined the fray. The escort Gambier Bay took hits from Japanese cruisers. Her flight deck was pocked with shell holes and fragments peppered her hangars. Yet her crew continued to launch every aircraft they could, sending every available plane aloft to harry the Japanese formation. The handful of aircraft from the 6 escort carriers, fewer than 180 in all, swarmed the enemy like a swarm of hornets. Most were armed with bombs and rockets intended for ground support rather than armor-piercing ordnance, and their weapons did little to dent heavily armored ships. Still, the pilots attacked with desperate boldness, flying repeated runs even when their ordnance was ineffective. Some, out of munitions, made dry runs to draw fire and throw off enemy gunners. Others staged simulated suicide dives and aggressive attacks on bridges that forced Japanese captains to maneuver at critical moments. A few strafed the mighty Yamato with 50 caliber guns, an act both futile and fiercely brave. The combined pressure from our surface ships and the constant aerial harassment began to take its toll. Kurita's formation was scattered across miles by evasive maneuvers and damage. Many Japanese vessels had been hit, and the element of surprise that had been central to his plan vanished. Then, at 0911, when it seemed our resistance would finally be crushed, the unthinkable happened. Admiral Kurita ordered a withdrawal. The most powerful Japanese surface force to assemble in years, poised to finish the job if it held course for another half hour, turned and steamed north, away from the invasion fleet. Historians would debate his motives for decades. Kurita later said he believed he faced a much larger American force and that pressing on risked destroying his fleet for too little gain. Reports suggesting fast American carrier task forces were closing from the north and east may also have influenced him, though those units were actually hundreds of miles distant. Whatever his reasons, Kurita's retreat ended the most desperate surface action in American naval history. The cost to us had been terrible. The destroyers Johnston and Hull, the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, and the escort carrier Gambier Bay were all lost. More than 1,500 American sailors and airmen were killed or wounded. But the strategic result was decisive. The Japanese fleet that had aimed to destroy the invasion force was driven off before it could reach its objective. Because of that stand, the thousands of American soldiers ashore on the beaches were spared the devastating bombardment Kurita's battleships could have delivered. The invasion continued, and the Allied advance toward the Japanese home islands went on. I was among those pulled from the sea after the Johnston finally sank at 10:10. Captain Ernest Evans was not recovered. He was last seen on the bridge, fighting his guns as the water closed over the pilot house. His Medal of Honor was posthumously awarded for the extraordinary courage he showed that morning. Of Johnston's 327 men, only 141 survived. We drifted in life rafts and clung to wreckage for hours before rescue, watching smoke from burning Japanese ships fade on the horizon. Many of those who died were boys younger than I was, volunteers who met their greatest test in that awful dawn. The full scale of what we had done only became clear later, when intelligence revealed the force we had faced. 4 battleships, including the massive Yamato with her 18-inch guns, 6 heavy cruisers with 8-inch batteries, and 11 destroyers, a combined fleet displacing more than 300,000 tons and mounting over 200 heavy guns. Against that armada, Taffy 3 could muster 6 escort carriers with roughly 180 aircraft, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. Our combined surface strength displaced under 25,000 tons and carried roughly 35 5-inch guns. By any rational calculation, we should have been annihilated within the first half hour. But war does not always obey arithmetic, and courage is not measured in tons of steel or caliber of gun. The sailors, airmen, and Marines who fought off Samar that morning proved that determination and sacrifice can overcome overwhelming odds. They showed that when American fighting men have their backs to the wall and their nation's cause is at stake, they will not give ground no matter the price. Japanese losses that day were heavy. The heavy cruisers Suzuya, Chikuma, and Chokai were sunk or so badly damaged they had to be scuttled. 3 destroyers went down, and several other ships were damaged enough to be out of action for months. Most critically, Japan's plan to defend the Philippines by decisive surface action was broken beyond repair. Admiral Kurita's decision to withdraw off. Samar marked the beginning of the end for the Imperial Japanese Navy as an effective surface force. They would never again gather such a powerful battle fleet or come so close to delivering a crushing blow to American naval power. The larger conflict around Leyte Gulf, of which the action off Samar was a part, would go down as one of the biggest naval engagements in history and a turning point that shattered Japanese sea power. For those of us who lived through it, though, the battle is remembered in far more intimate terms. The scream of 18-inch shells overhead, the sight of the little destroyer Hole driving straight at the Yamato in an almost certain death run, and the image of Lieutenant Commander Copeland bringing the tiny Samuel B. Roberts to point-blank range against cruisers that outgunned her 10-1. We remember the men who never came home, sailors like Gunner's Mate 3rd Class Paul Henry of the Samuel B. Roberts, who kept loading and firing even after being mortally wounded and died at his post with a round in his hands. Pilots like Lieutenant Commander Edward Huxtable, who with his controls shot away, steered his crippled torpedo plane into a Japanese cruiser and sacrificed himself to deliver a hit that helped protect others. Hundreds of men like them died far from home in seas most Americans couldn't find on a map, defending an invasion force they had never seen and saving soldiers they would never meet. Their sacrifice made a strategic difference. It allowed the American advance across the Pacific to continue, hastened the Japanese retreat toward final defeat, and helped ensure that victory would come to the Allies rather than a negotiated stalemate. The action off Samar lasted less than 3 hours, but its effects echoed through the rest of the Pacific campaign, proving that properly led and determined American forces could accomplish feats that looked impossible on paper. Above all, the battle showed that freedom demands sacrifice, and that ordinary men can do extraordinary things when their nation's survival is on the line. Writing more than 70 years later, I count myself among the dwindling number of survivors from that desperate morning off Samar. Most of my shipmates have been taken by time rather than by enemy action, but their stories endure in the memories and lessons we pass on. They remind us that victory is never guaranteed, that liberty exacts a price, and that sometimes the impossible becomes inevitable when brave people choose to stand and fight. The destroyers, Johnston, Howell, and Samuel B. Roberts, called tin cans in the Navy for their light armor and small size, proved on October 25, 1944, that a warship's real power lies not only in plating and guns, but in the courage of the men who sail her. Outgunned and outnumbered that dawn off Samar, they charged into history and, against all odds, helped secure a victory whose legacy is worth remembering and honoring as long as freedom endures.